Good morning. Welcome back for another exciting trip into the past of these United States. And today, what we're going to talk about is faith and reform, how new ideas showed the people of the early 19th century, the early and middle 19th century, that America might need to make a few changes around this place. And we'll start off with a brief discussion of a period known as the Second Great Awakening. It's called the Second Great Awakening because we've already had one back at the very beginning of the 1700s, late 1600s, early 1700s. And these Great Awakenings are periods where there is a serious revival, a renewal of religious zeal in America. And this is similar to the one that took place in the earlier 1700s. Basically, these are the grandchildren and great grandchildren of those people. And what this does is one of the issues that the Second Great Awakening teaches people is that it's an idea known as the social gospel, that you should show your faith publicly by working to improve society. Where you should be out there making the world a better place, following the teachings of Jesus Christ, and uh, who said things like feed the hungry, clothe the naked, help the poor, heal the sick, visit the afflicted or imprisoned. And so these people decided that, we need to really go along with these ideas that Jesus told people to do. And we'll show that we believe in them, in these teachings, by going out and doing the things we were told to do. So they could and should act to make things better in their society in America. And this is going to lead to a series of reform movements and utopian societies. And unusually, this was marked by interdenominational cooperation. The Methodists and the Baptists and the Congregationalists and most of the various different forms of particularly Protestant Christianity worked together somewhat on this. It was very ecumenical. They all believed that the idea spread across all of those sects. Still didn't work well with the Catholics, and they still didn't work well with some of the new religions that were coming up that were a little bit less mainstream, a little to them odd. But as a result of this Second Great Awakening, the dominant form of Christianity in America will become evangelist Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism, and it still is. That's why you see folks on TV a lot with the TV preachers coming on and telling you, do this, that, and the other, and everything. That's evangelicalism, and that form of Christianity is still the dominant form in our country. One of the things that's going to come out of the Second Great Awakening is a new religious faith. Formally, it's known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're more commonly referred to as the Mormons. And that's because of the Book of Mormon, which is an additional sacred text that they use besides the Christian Bible. And Mormons consider themselves to be Christian. Don't get me wrong. They just believe that Joseph Smith was a new prophet, and Joseph Smith was the founder of this faith, which he started in New York in 1830. And he published the Book of Mormon after he had seen a vision of, I believe it was the Archangel Gabriel came and gave him a new revelation, new information beyond what the Bible and everything said, and so he wrote all that down. Anyway, long and the short of it, I'm not an expert on them by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, so this is what happens, and he goes out and he starts gaining followers. He preaches and he gains followers. Their faith promoted plural marriage, polygamy, in the early days, as partly as a means to increase the size of their faith, because the easiest way to spread your faith is to have children and raise them in your faith, and the more you do that, the faster your religion will grow. And so partly they promoted plural marriage, so polygamy, to help them to grow. But because what they taught was different, weird, unusual for the time, they were not well liked. Um, they were forced to move by constant harassment and threats of violence. They leave, he starts in New York State. He's forced out of there. They go to Illinois, um, where Smith and his brother are actually murdered by an angry mob. They're jailed, and the lynch mob pulls them out of the jail and murders them. And that was in, I believe it's Nauvoo, Illinois. Then they move to Missouri for a while. They get harassed and everything there as well. And so their new leader, a fellow by the name of Brigham Young, will come up with the idea of moving west out of the United States. And so eventually most of them are going to migrate to the area that is now Utah, under the leadership of Brigham Young. And when they get there, through a lot of really hard work, they turn an area that was desolate into a place where they could live and farm and be successful. And unfortunately for them, the United States followed right behind them. They get out there in 1848, I believe it was, and the same year, the United States and Mexico go to war, and the United States defeats Mexico, and as part of the peace settlement, they get that territory that includes Utah. So they immediately become part of the United States again. Another philosophy that's going to come up in the early 1800s, and it's going to be stimulated by the European Romanticist movement, is going to be called transcendentalism. And Romanticism says that emotions are just as important as logic and reasoning in figuring out the answers to life, the universe, and everything. And transcendentalists take that idea one little step further, and they say that not just emotions about the world around you, but knowing yourself and being sort of very self-aware. And they said that by doing these things, we will create a new era in the world. And their informal leader is a fellow by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is a writer, a poet, and a philosopher. And these folks are basically sort of like proto-hippies, like the cavemen of all hippies. So they don't really have like a formal hierarchy or anything like that. They just have these ideas about how people should live together. And they're critical of society for, as they saw it, its unthinking conformity, which should sound familiar, maybe. And they urge that each person should find their own, as Ralph Waldo Emerson puts it, original relation to the universe. Emerson and his chief apostle, a fellow by the name of Henry David Thoreau, would seek that relationship in solitude. They would go and just hang out kind of in natural settings, in parks, in the woods, and things like that. And then they would write about what they sort of thought about while they were doing that. And oddly enough, though it's based loosely in a form of Christianity known as Unitarianism, the Transcendentalists were also fairly skeptical of religions. They thought that religions weren't necessarily bad, they just didn't think that they necessarily were a positive thing either. So anyway, by the 1840s, they've grown enough in number that they can start doing some interesting little experiments in how they ought to live. And so they start creating these utopian societies like Brook Farm. And as they start considering what the perfect society is like, they look even closer at the society in which they live. And one of the things that they see and think is just incredibly hypocritical is slavery in America, in a place that calls itself a free nation. And so they become increasingly vocal in their criticism of that. And so, what did transcendentalists believe? Basically, they've got sort of 4 points. Um, they say that man must acknowledge a body of moral truths that were intuitive and must transcend more sensational proof. That is, that there are just things that are right and wrong. There are things that are just the way that they are. And these things are intuitive. You just know it's right. There's no sensible proof. That is nothing that you can see, hear, touch, taste, feel, whatever. By sensible, that's what we mean, or sensational, something that's relation and is through one of your senses. And these moral truths are that there is an infinite benevolence of God, an infinite benevolence of nature, and that man is within himself a divine spark. Okay, so man is um, a divine inspiration. All of mankind is a divine inspiration in and of itself. They instinctively reject secular authority and organized churches of any kind, right? They believe that if man is divine, it would be wicked that he should be held in slavery or his soul corrupted by superstition, like most religions, they believe, or his mind clouded by ignorance. As they put it. And thus, the goal of the transcendental reformer is to restore man to the divinity which God had endowed them with. This is the basic idea. So it is a philosophy. It is almost religious. It's just not quite. It's saying that God is a creator, and but what he created were a bunch of lesser divine beings, and that, to deny ourselves that is wicked and wrong. And so, just a bit more about these utopian societies that the transcendentalists and others tried to create in the early 1800s. Um, and so, the first one is Brook Farm. It was founded by a bunch of transcendentalist writers, poets, artists, teachers, and they were trying to create a spiritual and intellectual society and not a capitalist one. And so when you joined, you had to basically give all your money to the farm. And it's mostly made up of relatively well-to-do people. The problem is not a single one of them knows how to farm. And so while they're all sitting around writing and painting and doing following their artistic and spiritual endeavors, nobody's feeding the chickens. Nobody's pulling weeds in the gardens and things. And so the farm is a financial failure. And as soon as everybody's trust fund money runs out, basically the place shuts down. Another uh, organization, another utopian society, uh, were the Shaker communities. And these were religious communities. They were actually self-sustaining, founded in across New York and New England. Very strictly religious principles, not like cruel or anything, but just they had a hard lifestyle to follow, and basically they felt that they were creating almost a heaven on earth by following these rules. And so they would have a not necessarily an easy life, but a good one, a blessed one. And part of what they do is they preach sexual equality, that men and women are equals. They forbade marriage because they uh, felt that marriage put men in a dominant position over women. They forbade sex. They were celibate, which of course makes it hard for their community to grow. And originally, for years they would adopt orphans, lots and lots and lots of orphans. But most of them, when they grew up, they didn't stay because it's a hard lifestyle that these people are choosing. Um, there is still one community of Shakers. It's down to two members who are both elderly, one man and one woman, and they're both, like I said, fairly old, and it's a dying community, quite literally. Uh, the Oneida Society, Oneida, New York. It was led by a fellow by the name of John Noyes, or Noyes. The community was a Fourierist socialism. Basically, that means that everybody owned everything. That there was essentially no such thing as private property within it. That included uh, your husband and or wife, and they practiced a concept known as complex marriage that essentially meant that all members of the community were married to one another. And what that really meant was that the leader would use his position to manipulate his followers' sex lives, particularly the sex lives of young women whom he had relations with on multiple occasions. It was a cult. In modern terms, we'd look at it and go, these people were a cult. He ends up actually having to flee to Canada. He has to run away and leave the country to avoid going to prison for a variety of crimes, including bigamy, being married to more than one person at a time. They supported themselves through a variety of endeavors, including making flatware, silverware, and then selling that as a means of making money. And they owned the factory that did that in common. And so as the community collapsed, the company was actually still doing well. So they basically turned it into a capitalist corporation, and it still exists. There's still an Oneida flatware company, and it's the same one that started way back then. So all of these people are thinking, hey, we need to make the world a better place. We want to live in a more perfect society. And while not everybody wants to go to the extreme of pulling up roots and moving to a town and redoing their whole life, they still have the idea that they can make the world a better place. And so to do that, they're going to start pressing for reforms. And so we're going to talk about antebellum reforms. By the way, antebellum simply means before the war. This is a period before the Civil War. The temperance movement was the campaign to stop or at least reduce seriously the drinking of alcohol, which had become a serious, serious problem in America. Americans in the early 1800s drank about 7.1 gallons per capita in the 1830s. That's the equivalent of about 5 drinks per day. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that that means for every baby that's not having any drinks, somebody's having 10. 10 drinks in a single day is a lot, y'all. Um, Nowadays, the average consumption is about 2.4 gallons, at least as of 2015, which was the most recent statistics I could find. So it's like a third. It's not quite 2 drinks. It's like 1 2/3 drinks per day. Heavy drinking causes lots of social problems. Okay, alcohol abuse causes lots of social problems: unemployment, crime, poverty, violence, neglect. You know, women jumped on the bandwagon of temperance because they wanted to stop their husbands from going and blowing their paychecks in a saloon every week before any of the bills got paid, coming home drunk and beating up on them. Because that sort of thing happened fairly frequently. The issue becomes so strong that there's so much of a problem that businesses actually start to push temperance because they need their workers to come back from lunch sober. These men would go to work and go to lunch, get drunk, and come back to work lit up, and they couldn't work, and they break machines and things. So um, the factory owners, to a large degree, actually kind of get behind this, and of course their overall goal would be to make alcohol illegal, and they'll actually accomplish that for a brief period in the early 1900s during Prohibition and the 18th Amendment that sets that up. We'll talk about that in 1302. And so this is the sort of thing that would be published and put out by the temperance societies, found in magazines and things to show the dangers of drinking. It's called the Drunkard's Progress. And at step one, you're just having a glass with a friend over there at the left. Not really a big deal, right? And you go through the steps and you get a little bit more. Step three, you're a glass too much and you're kind of kind of drunk and useless. At step five, you're at the top. You're having fun and it's all good and life is easy um, and then you start to decline. At step six, you've got poverty and disease. You've spent all your money on drink and having fun. By step eight, you're desperate. You're a desperate criminal. And the last step, step nine, is death by suicide. Death by suicide meant back in those days that you couldn't even be buried in a churchyard, in a cemetery that was religious. You had to be buried in unhallowed ground. And so there you see at the bottom, the wife and child abandoned. You're buried in a pauper's unmarked grave, and they're bereft and homeless too. You see, they're not in that house behind them, and you've destroyed your family's life by being a drunkard. Another area of reform is going to be education. Prior to the 1830s, most people didn't get much of an education, at least not much of a public education. But at about that time, which coincides with all these other things, a growing number of Americans began to advocate that there should be a free public education to, at least the equivalent of about eighth grade for everybody, especially if they were urban area white boys. Girls were expected to get less, maybe learn to do their reading and writing and a little bit of basic arithmetic, things like that. Minority children weren't expected really to be able to have the intellectual capacity to do it beyond the very basics, which of course is just flat out racism at the time. But they believed that they should push for free public educations, that it would create better workers and a better Republican society. And this idea really takes hold in 1837 when a fellow by the name of Horace Mann, who later became known as the father of education in America, says that education is the great equalizer, that this is the way that people from all levels of society, especially young white boys, could achieve the same as each other. Okay, so that a boy from a poor background could be just as well off as someone who came from a wealthy background if only they had an education. And so Horace Mann takes control of the Massachusetts Board of Education and pursues free, equal, non-religious schooling for everybody and provides for trained, well-paid professional teachers. And his reforms are going to set the standard for public education. He requires that they have things like diplomas. He requires that they actually get paid a cash wage. Before the 1830s, it was not uncommon at all for a school teacher to be only slightly better educated than the students that they were teaching. And they would often be paid partially with room and board. They would be paid in kind. So, like, if you were a chicken farmer, you would pay the school teacher to teach her children by giving her eggs and things like that. Um, Horace Mann gets rid of that and turns it into a real profession. The next area of reform is going to be in the jails. In early America, there weren't very many prisons. Prisons are expensive. You have to pay to build them, you have to pay guards for them. The people in them are not productive, really, citizens usually. So you have to then raise taxes to take care of them, and people didn't like that. So in those eras, if you were caught, say, stealing something, uh, you would have been publicly whipped, humiliated, and then let go. If you kept it up, they would hang you. If you did something serious, they just executed you. That was about it. By the early 1800s, however, you would find yourself being thrown into a large common cell. One not really all that big room with a lot of people jammed into it. And you would have pickpockets in there with murderers and rapists and embezzlers. And so everybody was thrown in the same cell, whether they were violent criminals, whether they were nonviolent criminals, or whatever. And of course, that led to lots of issues. Food was scanty. They didn't usually get fed very much, and what they did get was not very good. The guards were brutal and cruel. The conditions that they lived in were primitive, to say the least. The toilet was a bucket, for example. Reformers, influenced by the ideas of transcendentalism and the social gospel from the Second Great Awakening, said, there's got to be a better way to do this, to treat these people more like, they're still people and not dangerous animals that need to be caged up. And so they try a lot of experiments in prison reform, and a lot of them fail, like most things. When you try new things, a lot of times it doesn't work out the way you hope it will. But some lasting reforms do begin in the 1830s. One thing they stopped doing is they stopped using quite so much physical punishment. It used to be if you spoke without being spoken to, they would drag you out and tie you to a post and beat you with a whip. You would be flogged. Um, they get rid of that. They start working on ideas of, instead of just being punishment, let's do some rehabilitation. Let's give these men, and it was almost always men, a new way of making a living rather than returning to crime when they get out. So they did things like literacy programs and prison libraries to help them to get skills that would help them when they got out of prison to maybe get a different, better job and then not return to a life of crime. Now, if you think the prisons sound bad, American mental institutions or insane asylums were far worse. Americans with all kinds of mental problems had basically been kept in cells like prisons. Uh, and it was just horrific. I mean, they chained them to the walls. They were kept in cages. They were kept naked so that they wouldn't, foul their clothes or whatever. They were beaten. We're going to beat the crazy out of you was a thing. Cold water, basically torture. We're going to torture the crazy out of you. That really doesn't work, but we'll make it work. Well, of course it doesn't. It doesn't help. And a woman named Dorothea Dix actually gets herself. She's a journalist. She actually got herself committed into an institution. She went undercover and got herself committed to an institution, and saw with her own eyes what happened to the mentally ill. When she got out, she wrote a report, went to the Massachusetts State government and said, this is what's going on. This is insane. The people that are running these places should be locked up, not the people in them. And so she and other reformers helped in the creation of public institutions dedicated to the humane treatment of mental illness, treating them like people who were sick, not like people who were bad. Not like they were prisoners, but like they were patients. And though some of the things that they did at the time, we look at and go, what the heck are you doing? Like lobotomies were pretty common. Or they started electroconvulsive shock therapy, uh, things like that. Medications they gave were pretty rough on people, and so a lot of the methods that they used seem primitive and scary to us now, but they were at least attempts to make the lives of the people who were suffering better. Now, there's arguments as to whether or not they were, but that was their intent, their goal. It was no longer just to lock them up, hide them away from the public eye, and keep them an embarrassing secret. It was now to let's try and help these people. Another reform movement that starts in the years prior to the Civil War and that doesn't really see its success until the early 20th century, like Prohibition, is suffrage. And this is the fight to get women the right to vote. And it was led by women who had gotten actually originally involved in reform through the abolition movement, primarily. And it really kicks off in 1848 when two women organized a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, very originally known as the Seneca Falls Convention. And they met to discuss the idea of women getting the right to vote. One of the more famous people that attended was Frederick Douglass, who is most famous for his work in abolition, but he really believed that everybody should be treated equally, and so he was a part of the suffragist movement as well. Just like many of the women who became very big suffragists had been involved or were involved in the abolition movement as well. A lot of the reformers were involved in multiple areas of reform. They wanted to change lots of parts of society, not just the one. But they also had to sort of pick where they were going to spend the majority of their effort. The result of the Seneca Falls Convention, which lasted for just a few days, was a document called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, which denounced concepts like coverture, which is where the property of a woman becomes the property of her husband or her nearest male kin, rather than her own, and calling for more opportunities for things like higher education, property rights, and an end to sexual double standards, along with the right to vote. Which, of course, they believed that if they had the right to vote, they could get all these other things. So eventually, of course, we all know that the 19th Amendment will be eventually passed. That'll be not, however, until 1920. So some early major suffragists were Lucretia Mott, who along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton demanded equal rights for women. Susan B. Anthony, who was an organizer who had first worked for the abolition movements, and she's the one who really builds the women's movement into a national organization. And she puts a lot of stress on the idea that women must have a purse of their own, she said. That basically women need to have control of their own money and their own property, and that until that was true, that they would never really have a chance to be equal. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a friend of Frederick Douglass, and that's her pictured there to the right, she was not satisfied with proving that she was as good as men, because she had already done that. She had gotten an education. She had come from wealth and privilege, and so she had opportunities because of her wealth that most women would never have had. So she wasn't content with proving that she herself was just as good as any man, but that all women should be seen as equal to men, and that was really her big goal. So this is an excerpt from the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments that comes out of the Seneca Falls Convention, and it's obviously based on the Declaration of Independence. And they added one little phrase in this part where it says that all men and women, which is why it's underlined, that I did that, are created equal, rather than just all men. And through the grievances part, instead of grievances against King George III, of course, they have grievances that women have against men and society, which has kept them in a sort of a second place role that they think or believe that it shouldn't be that way anymore, or should not have happened. So I've saved the biggest and most confrontational and most successful in the 19th century reform movement for last. And that's going to be the abolition movement. Of course, there had always been some resistance to slavery, generally speaking, from the slaves themselves. But none of them are really successful in the United States. The only successful slave uprising in the New World is going to be in Haiti, and that'll be in the early 1800s. But in 1831, there was a slave rebellion led by a man named Nat Turner. He was a slave in Virginia. He had a religious vision. He had learned to read. He read the Bible. Was a zealot, a religious zealot. He was very important to him. He became a lay preacher amongst the slaves. Anyway, he had a vision in which he was instructed, he believed, to lead a rebellion. And so in August of 1831, Turner and his followers on the plantation rose and killed 55 white men, women, and children at the plantation he lived on and some of the neighboring ones. He then attempted to seize an armory, a place where the local militia or the U.S. forces would store weapons, guns, and powder and stuff like that for war. He attempted to seize an armory and then fled into the swamps where he thought he would attract hundreds and hundreds of followers from the uh, surrounding plantations and such. And what ends up happening is he gets about 60 followers. Um, Within hours, the militia has been called out. They, within days, have hunted down and defeated Turner's followers. And they start really taking revenge for the murders of the white men, women, and children before that even. And it's incredibly vicious and bloody. They literally start stringing up, hanging, lynching black men and women for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, including some that were free, including many that had nothing whatsoever to do with this rebellion. And Turner's followers were all killed. Turner himself was captured and hanged, as an example. But about 200 or so innocent blacks were killed beyond the ones that actually rose up and killed those people. And so what happens is things get worse. And that happens after every slave rebellion, is that things get worse. And that's because they've scared the people in power. And when you scare people who have power to pass laws, what happens is they pass laws to make themselves feel better. And so they pass laws that are very strict on slaves in the South. Instead of gaining freedom, it's going to lead to stronger slave codes, the end of any chance of gradual emancipation in the South. They've terrified the white people. They've scared the white people, and that's not going to, in the long run, help them. And so it really has the opposite effect, of course, of what Turner and his followers wanted. Rather than freedom, they got death and more oppression for the people left behind. So abolition is the name given to the movement to end slavery. It's easily the most well-known of the 19th century reforms. Like many things, it started in Britain and expanded. Before the Second Great Awakening, there were not many abolitionists. There were a few, and they opposed slavery, generally speaking, on political principles. The idea that if we live in a nation of liberty and freedom and republicanism, then if we say all men are created equal, we really should not have slaves. That they are endowed with, inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of. So how can we say that when we keep people in bondage? But by the 1830s, their language is changing, and evangelical abolitionists begin to condemn the practice as a sin, and this is the result of the Second Great Awakening. And these folks will be the ones who create the American Anti-Slavery Society. The most outspoken of the abolitionists was a man named William Lloyd Garrison. He had many death threats against him. He was that outspoken. He was the publisher of a newspaper in Boston called The Liberator. And in it, he spoke constantly, he and the people that wrote for it and everything, spoke constantly about the evils of slavery, the need for abolition, and for the proper treatment of African Americans in our society. Along with him was a man named Frederick Douglass, who was himself an escaped slave and who became a very popular writer and public speaker. He gave public speeches about his life as a slave, which were very influential towards getting people to understand exactly what it went on. Because a lot of people in the North were very insulated from it. They didn't really see it. It wasn't, they knew it existed, but it was just, oh yeah, they have this weird thing. I don't know why they do that. It was sort of how they thought. As long as it didn't affect them, they didn't much care. And so Douglass helps to bring the idea home. Another person who does that is a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she does that by writing a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which if you've never read it, you really probably ought to. Basically, the book shows all of the different ways that slaves were treated, from the very best way that slaves were treated to the very worst way. But the point that it drives home is that at no time is this right. That even the most benign families, the nicest, kindest, take care of the slaves, let them be pretty autonomous, let them do extra work for themselves and make themselves money. All of that. Even the best people who would do stuff like that, even the best people were corrupt, that they had power that was just inappropriate for people to have over another. Another pair of abolitionists were the Grimke sisters. What makes them different is that they were actually women of the Southern planter class who sold off, well, didn't sell off, but freed, emancipated all of their slaves. And that was very controversial. It was actually kind of dangerous for these women. Um, and a group of abolitionists, and these folks had always been opposed to slavery, was the Society of Friends, the Quakers. Big supporters of the Underground Railroad, big abolitionists. They had pretty much always been opposed to it, but now their ideas are really starting to take root. So abolitionism's successful methodology is to sort of take a three-pronged approach. They don't approach it from just one angle. They come at it from different ways. And I think that's part of what helped to make it a successful movement. One of them was the religious appeal. Now remember, there's an upswell of religious feeling in America, particularly in the North at the time. And so religious appeals using passages from the Bible to discredit slavery is going to help. They talk about the Hebrews being released from Egyptian captivity and things like that. The second prong is going to be to aid the fugitive slaves. Abolitionists created and maintained the Underground Railroad and would arrange for jobs in the North, papers in the North for escaped slaves. Eventually, the Underground Railroad would, of course, extend all the way to Canada. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the near future. The last of the three-pronged assault is the political appeals in the form of petitions, which started circulating as early as 1835. And these were petitions that were signed by thousands of people, organized by the American Anti-Slavery Society, and delivered to congressmen, senators, and political candidates and office holders in Washington, D.C., pressing the idea of outlawing the institution of slavery in America. Unlike most of the other reforms, abolition met with serious, organized, sometimes violent resistance across the nation. In the North, factory workers didn't want to get rid of slavery because they were worried that freed slaves would become competition for the jobs that they had. In the South, planters feared, of course, the loss of their wealth, slaves being a fairly large percentage of the value of the property that they owned. And poorer whites feared the loss of their social standing and competition, again, for work as farm laborers. They didn't want to see slaves freed for those reasons. In all regions of the country, most white people, heck, even most black people, to be honest, even most abolitionists were very strongly opposed to what they used to call amalgamation or miscegenation. That is, the mixing of races, particularly through intermarriage. That was just beyond the pale for most people. To be honest, essentially, we would consider almost all of the people back in that day, even some of the most progressive, most vehement abolitionists, we would still consider a lot of those people to be racist in our modern times. And that's why it's hard to, and not really fair, honestly, to not look at people through the lens of their own times. If you're going to try to judge whether someone's a good person or a bad person, you need to kind of judge them partially, at least, by the standards of their time. So it's hard to, you don't want to go around saying things like Abraham Lincoln was a terrible racist. But the fact of the matter is, by our modern conventions, we would probably call him a racist. He certainly didn't believe that blacks and whites were equals. He didn't. If you read his writings, you can see that. However, he was opposed to slavery for a variety of reasons, both moral and political. So it's a complex issue to deal with when we study the past, is to try to look at people and make judgments about them based on a historical lens rather than a contemporary one. You don't want to look at them and say, well, this was just a terrible person. Now, we can say that this was a person who was doing the best they could in a bad society. That's a different thing. Because we definitely want to look at societies and say, hey, we need to change things. Things aren't good. We need to change things. And that's what these people, the abolitionists, were doing. And for that, I think they deserve, some respect, honestly. Now, not every black in America was a slave. The majority were, by far. But of those that weren't, most lived in the North, about half, a little bit more, and the rest mostly lived in coastal cities of the South, like New Orleans or Galveston or Charleston or one of those, the bigger coastal cities. Most of them would work as farm laborers or as domestic servants, basically doing the same jobs that many enslaved African Americans were doing, but doing it for themselves, for their own pay. Virtually nowhere did they have the same rights as white men. Only in Massachusetts could they even vote or testify in court against a white man. In most places, they weren't allowed to do those things. They were always in fear of being illegally taken as escaped slaves, even though many of them had been born free and had never been slaves. Heck, there was a movie about it not that long ago, 12 Years a Slave. Good movie, by the way. But there was always that fear. And yet some African Americans were able to overcome all of these obstacles and still become wealthy, influential people. A couple, just to show that, Benjamin Banneker was an architect and designer, and he's the guy that actually did the layout for our capital city of Washington, D.C. Paul Cuffey in Massachusetts started off as a laborer and eventually owned a fleet of merchant vessels and warehouses and things, became quite wealthy in Boston. Many of the free blacks embraced an idea known as social uplift. And this is the idea that if they acted in a way that white middle class America would call respectable at all times, they had to be like above reproach, then they would eventually gain social equality. And to a degree, that's true. To a degree, it's not. It certainly helps push African Americans along that route. But it doesn't overcome the ingrained and taught prejudices of centuries in America. And it's still something that we're working on. So that's going to do it for today. Please be sure that you've read this chapter and looked at things that I didn't really discuss, like changes to urban society and such. And then be sure to read chapter 11 and look out for quizzes for chapters 10 and 11 to post in the near future. We should have a test coming up next week. So, all that being said, have a great day.